This week, I'm joined by Matt Alderman. First, we're going to interview Nik Whitfield. He's the CEO at Panaseer, and we're going to talk about continuous controls monitoring. In the enterprise news, SecureWorks is launching some new services. StackRock's Kubernetes security platform for Red Hat container certification has been announced. SIM solutions firm Exabeam has raised $75 million, and serverless monitoring startup Espagon, did I say that right? Espagon expands to cover broader microservices. In our last segment, we've got a security industry briefings update. We're going to talk about 42 Crunch, Veridium, White Canyon, and Eclipsium. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. The Viavi Solutions Observer Platform provides SecOps teams a powerful combination of comprehensive data for threat hunting and incident response that includes wire data analytics and enriched flow records. Using pure, unaltered packet and net flow, Observer presents views across the entire IT infrastructure with threat alert features including scope, impact, and advanced traffic profiling. Teams can use automated workflows to dive into high-fidelity network evidence and more quickly resolve issues, minimizing impact on customers, users, and business operations. Learn more about the Viavi Network Security Solution and download free resources at securityweekly.com/Viavi. That's VIAVI. Is the fear of a cyber attack keeping you up at night? Are you worried that your business isn't properly protected? Keep your network up to date and secure from vulnerabilities with VSA by Kaseya. Kaseya's VSA patch management module installs, deploys, and updates all of your software from a single console. Kaseya's network antivirus provides real-time updates and ensures maximum security. Start sleeping peacefully all night long. To watch VSA in action, request a demo today by visiting securityweekly.com/Kaseya. That's Kaseya. The greatest threat to businesses today isn't the outsider trying to get in. It's the people you trust, the ones who already have the keys, your employees, contractors, and privileged users. 60% of online attacks are carried out by insiders. To stop these insider threats, you need to see what users are doing before an incident occurs. Observe It enables security teams to detect risky user activity, investigate incidents in minutes, and effectively respond. Get your free trial at observeit.com/securityweekly. Welcome, everyone, to episode 136 of Enterprise Security Weekly. It's May 8th, 2019. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by Mr. Matt Alderman. Matt, welcome.
I am in my sweater again, getting ready for another blast of snow. Yes, wow. Folks, we get snow in Colorado up until Mother's Day. Never, ever plant anything before Mother's Day in the state.
It's warm and kind of springish here. It's actually not raining, which is a change from the past few weeks. You can register for our upcoming webcast with Observe It and Kaseya by going to securityweekly.com/webcasts. If you missed any of the previous ones, you can go to securityweekly.com/on-demand. Let's see. Our guest for this segment is Nik. Sorry. I'm having trouble seeing my teleprompter because I'm old. Basically, Matt. Nik Whitfield, he's the CEO at Panaseer. He founded the company with the mission to help security leaders make data-driven decisions that they can confidently defend to key stakeholders. His team has created a continuous controls monitoring platform for cybersecurity, and Nik is here to tell us all about it and talk about what is continuous controls monitoring. Nik, welcome.
Yeah, hi. And just to fill you in on the global weather, I'm in London and it's been pouring with rain today. So living up to all your expectations in every Hollywood film.
That's right.
Yeah, except for you're not cold enough to turn it into snow because I live at 7,500 feet in elevation. Right. So I get snow.
Matt loves the thin air. So, Matt, where do you want to start with continuous controls monitoring?
Yeah, I mean, look, Paul, you and I have had experience in the continuous controls monitoring space when you and I worked back at Tenable. So I think the first thing for the audience and for Nik is, what is continuous controls monitoring? I think depending on who you talk to, it might have a definition. I'd love to understand kind of Nik's take on what is continuous controls monitoring.
It's a good question. And for a start, I didn't come up with the phrase, right? I'm just adopting it because other people have started using it again. And it's the financial institutions mostly that we're talking to who are employing CCM, as we call it. And I think the easiest way to think about it is a layer above all of the technical controls that you have in the enterprise to bring the data together, unify the data across those assets and controls, so that you can provide a perspective on that data to all of the key stakeholders that you have, and of course yourselves as a security team. And the analogy I use sometimes is that, back in finance, in the CFO organization, they used to have a similar problem to security, right? They had loads of different systems that were collecting data and producing data about how much money was being spent, what stuff people were buying, and whether it was expense management systems and travel management systems, procurement systems, and so on. But all of their key stakeholders, whether you were head of a business line, head of a cost center, the board, the exco, an auditor, they all needed a perspective on the truth of what money was coming in and what money was going out. And that's why they invented ERP solutions. And an ERP is a good analogy for CCM. It's a way of bringing data together across all of those systems. And we're not talking about money and security, we're talking about assets, controls, vulnerabilities, and threats, unifying that data and providing access to key stakeholders so they can get metrics and measurement about what's going on and then make, hopefully, good decisions about it.
So, Paul, do you remember my sales kickoff keynote in 2015 at Tenable?
Yes, I was definitely paying attention and have copious notes on it.
So, yeah. what I laid out at that keynote, and to Nik, to your point, right, is security doesn't have an equivalent to the ERP system. It just doesn't. And so the question is, how do you take all this disparate security data and give the CISOs a central view? Now, there are a number of people in the industry that would tell you that's the GRC platforms, right? And I've worked for 2 GRCs. My first startup was a GRC platform. I went to Archer under RSA to try to fix Archer. And the challenge with the GRCs is they weren't really built for scale. They were great to be able to bring some data elements together, but they couldn't scale to really the size of the data that's sitting out there in the security space. And so we tried it from the top down. Some would tell you that some of the security vendors sitting at the bottom are in a position to do this on the way up. And I attempted this at Qualys. We attempted this at Tenable, and others have attempted it. And there was always what I believe this kind of gap in the middle that sat between the security solutions and tools where all the data sits and the GRC platforms that could unify data at scale and give you the ability to really understand what's going on to make appropriate decisions. That's kind of where the CCM or the continuous controls monitoring kind of market probably sits, right, Nik?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's between those layers, right? At the end of the day, you've got key stakeholders like board members and regulators and so on who need an aggregated, summarized view that you can slice and dice by business line and geography and cost center or region or whatever it is. But you have to build that off all of the nuts and bolts of security, which, and God knows we've bought enough tools, right? I mean, we've got enough endpoint systems and scanners and IT systems and so on. We have all the information. So you take a classic use case, right, which is, so the way we put it is there are three key questions that we have to answer if we're going to do security well. 1, what technical assets am I defending? 2, are my controls deployed against those assets? And 3, are those controls operating within the policy that we've decided would make them effective? Because if I know my assets, all my controls are switched on and they're all operating within policy, kind of hallelujah, I've got the best security I can do for the money that I've spent. But obviously, when we look, that's not really what we see. We see, well, we don't really understand all of our technical assets, or maybe sometimes we understand them some of the time. And our control coverage, we kind of know some of the time. And it's a bit, I was talking to someone the other day, and it's a bit like, let's say I was in charge of a prison. Thank God I'm not. That wouldn't be good for anybody. But it's like I'm in charge of the prison security, but I don't really know how many cells we have in the prison. I don't really know how many prisoners we've got. I don't really know who they are. I might know some of these things some of the time, but I don't know if the cells have doors, and I don't know if the doors have locks on. I don't know if the locks are locked every day of the week. And it kind of that's kind of where we are as security. And I think we're not really at the point where we need to be, which is having answers to those questions continuously all of the time, in the same way that you would in finance, for example. So a classic use case would be, well, so who's got an accurate, complete CMDB listening here? It's like, well, probably not, I'm guessing, because I've never seen one and I've never built one and maintained one. But the irony is we've got enough data that tells us about devices and applications that are being used in the environment, right? We can get our Active Directory feed, we can get our vuln scan data, we can get our AV console, our EDR console, we can get SCCM, and if we can stitch all of that together, then we get a really nice view of what devices are on the network any day of the week or at any moment in time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. All those things are moving targets, right? What assets I have is constantly changing every single day. The configuration that I should be testing against in my controls, like even the definition of controls, changes so much. We talk about Active Directory security quite a bit. And when Josh Abraham was on last week, we were talking about how we coach organizations and knowing, like, this is what the attackers are doing. And here's some configuration things that you can do to make the attackers' lives pretty miserable. And those are like new things that everyone like all the time. Security researchers and attackers are coming with these new techniques. So the definition of what controls you have changes. And then, of course, there are people like me sometimes that go in and change a configuration that, one line in a script or one parameter in your cloud configuration can have a huge impact. It's whether or not that S3 bucket is exposed or not. It's whether your Docker's using SSL or not. That stuff can change even on an automated basis, as we've seen major outages from a lot of large providers. And sometimes that comes back to, that configuration change didn't go so well, right? So all those three things make it, I think, especially challenging for those in enterprises today.
Yeah, and it's worth saying we know why this is, right? It's really hard. It's not right. It's not by accident, especially if we're in, I've worked in banks all my life pretty much, and I used to build trading systems and probably did quite a lot of things that were bad for security, DMZ and with cesium atomic clocks and other things. But it's hard, right? Because a lot of this stuff has been built as legacy. Policies changed over time. Our environments have changed over time. And we've been trying to understand this stuff and report on this stuff manually. And I get it. It's a difficult problem to solve.
Yeah, you hit on three kind of big challenges, right? In when we were at Tenable, Paul and I kind of laid out some what we thought were some interesting domains around this topic. The first one is discover. What's on my network? What do I have? Where are my assets? And you talked about it's CMDB, it's vulnerability scanners. I mean, it's all over the place. It's your cloud assets out of your cloud accounts. I mean, this problem's getting bigger and harder to solve, but that core discovery component of identifying your assets was always one of those things we talked about first, which I think organizations just struggle with still to this day, because I can't effectively do anything around assessment, assessing for vulnerabilities, assessing for misconfigurations, if I don't know what assets I'm supposed to be assessing. And then to the third domain, which is really what I consider continuous monitoring, is the monitor domain. It's that constant ongoing reevaluation of my discover and assessment to make sure that they're still in check, right? With policy or whatever, there's constantly new vulnerabilities coming out. Are my patches being applied? Those three core domains, to me, are the root of continuous controls monitoring, but are not easy to actually implement. So I'd love to know how you're attempting to solve some of those aspects? And are those three domains kind of right?
Yeah, oh God, God forbid I tell the world what's right. I think they're three important domains, but part of our challenge is there are so many important domains in security. You know, you look at identity and access management, privileged access management, user awareness testing, application security. There are so many domains that we have to do well in order to have good security. And each of those domains requires, in my opinion, requires data analytics, because there aren't enough of us security professionals. There aren't enough data analyst security professionals. And even if there were, doing it manually doesn't make sense anymore, because it just takes too long and we don't come up with the right answers frequently enough. But yeah, I think if I look at the work we do and the customers we do it with, getting device inventory right is key. Understanding vulnerability analysis and making sure we're doing that across all of our assets is key. Just switching on endpoint, right? The data would suggest, where we look at customers, that kind of between 60 and 90% of the time, the endpoint tool, the EDR tool, hasn't been deployed. And so you've got a whole load of assets sitting there which haven't got your last line of defense running, but often we think it is running, and it's only by piecing the puzzle together do you realize those assets don't have that control. And I suppose to get into how we can solve it, it really is the correlation of those data sets, not in the monitor and respond phase. I don't mean from a threat detection point of view, not from a SIM, not from a triage point of view. This is in the risk phase. This is in how do we become more secure in the first place? And the stitching together of those data sets, we use a process called entity resolution to do it. It's a form of correlation. And it basically says, let's move away from device, let's move to application. For the data sets that I'm pulling, can I identify the same applications between those data sets? Can I detect the same accounts between those data sets, or the same devices? So I can join them together, and then that gives me the triangulation, if you like. That gives me the correlation, the compare and contrast, to say, well, what is in this one that isn't in this one? And what's in that one that isn't in these ones? And by doing that, we can form this full picture to say, I can see these things in here, but I can't see them in here. That means we've got a coverage gap. That means we can go and do something quite easy, often, to go and fill that gap and switch controls on. And that really is what we call the baseline truth. That's the baseline truth. And if you do that well, you then have metrics that are meaningful. You then have metrics that don't create a shitload of politics. Excuse my language, it's later here in the UK. They don't create a load of politics, because the problem with metrics these days is you create them, they're either ignored because no one believes them, or someone scratches the surface and finds, well, that metric's not right because there's some data that means that it isn't. If you get that fundamental truth that everyone agrees on, you can then go and take action about it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the hardest challenges, is what are those right metrics? We know that number of vulnerabilities is not the right metric. But if I can start to evaluate my metrics down to things like, well, how many assets are we actually scanning and not scanning? Or how many assets have EDR running or not running, right? To your point, those become a little more actionable, because now you can really say, oh, we should be scanning those, or we should have EDR deployed on those. And in just understanding that in itself is really difficult.
Mm-hmm. It is. And then the beauty is you can then layer different measurement over the top. So once you have coverage licked, you can then look at, policy adherence for, take AV as a simple example. I want to know every day what my metrics are for definitions updatedness across every machine in my environment. I want to know whether they're scanning frequently enough across every machine in my environment every day. And I want a list of the worst performers so I can go to the accountable owners and say, hey, these machines aren't running their controls properly. You can apply the same to vulnerability management. You can do it for patch management. IDAM, PAM, these are traditional KPIs, KRIs. I suppose the difference is, instead of doing them on a periodic basis with spreadsheets and pens and paper and consultative interviews, we're just saying plug the damn data in and do it automatically. And that allows us to, react quicker, but also create an iteration do this faster, work out what are the best metrics, which ones can we act on, and then we can demonstrate that we're improving our security posture. We can report success, which we don't get to do much in security, or the poor schmoes in IT who actually have to do the work. By doing this, they can show improvement in metrics over a short time frame, which is great for morale.
Yeah, it's the reverse of the attacker, right? And we always say, well, attackers have it easier. They only need to find one thing. We need to fix and secure all the things, but it's the reverse. I mean, I was a penetration tester, and I'm very, communicate with people who are doing that today. And the common theme, there's several common themes, but one is they're just looking for that one mistake you made, that one missing control, and that's really all they need to gain a foothold and start moving inside the environment and find the data that might be, most damaging to be stolen, for example. And I think from the defender's point of view, you have to be able to very quickly identify those variances, and that's just the first step. Then you got to fix them, right? And I think that's often where a lot of the, where the rubber meets the road. And what we found, working at Tenable, where there were a lot of clients like, yeah, we can do a great job of finding all the vulnerabilities, but I can't convince my Windows admins to fix them and all that. That was the harder thing, right? That is so critical.
Yeah, actually, on that specific point, what's really powerful is if you have side-by-side metrics for different technology platforms or business lines or whatever it might be, and say, yeah, your vulnerability profile across this part of your environment is, whatever the metric is, 86% fix rate or whatever it might be. And in your part, it's only 45%. Now, what we find is when you present the metrics and kind of gamify it like that, you suddenly get a lot more responsiveness from people and a willingness to go and deal with these things. So a lot of it's in A, using trusted data, and B, the presentation of it so people feel like they want to. And sorry to jump in again, but on your point of, as an attacker, you have all the advantage because you're nimble and agile and you've got a whole range of tooling to draw from. That's true. If you think of the analogy of the burglar in your home, the burglar has certain advantages there. The advantage in your home is all of the nooks and crannies, the ins and outs, where all of the tools are, the weapons, the light switches. So the better we know our home, the better we know our technical environment, the better we can defend.
Yeah, and most teams do, but I think it's hard to get those things fixed, right? I mean, how many times has a consultant gone in for any type of assessment and the folks that work there are like, yeah, you need to start over there because that's the area where we know the most controls are missing, and we need to highlight that so we get into that meeting and we can compare and contrast and ultimately fix the problems. I mean, you don't want to shame people, right? But you want to have models that this department's doing very well. Why don't we model that in the other departments, for example?
Right, so it's spreading best practice.
Yes.
So it's interesting because in your ecosystem, right, you have to bring data in from various sources, do this entity kind of relationship structure. But you're not in the response side of the house, which means you're also integrating into some of the SIM platforms and some of the other SOAR and other platforms that are out there on the response, or where do those lines get drawn?
So at the moment we play in the prepare and protect space. We're very much about, the way we see it is the most expensive place in a hospital is the emergency room. So let's try and stay out of the emergency room, be preventative in our care. So we play in the prepare and protect phase. The value of this data is there for detect and respond when they're triaging an event, right, or a correlated event. And that's where, if you do this unification of data, not only do you get a view of, for example, an aggregation of all the devices on the network, you also get a view of a single device across, say, 5 data sources. So you can paint this rich picture of a device and say, what does that look like to Canada? What does that look like to McAfee? What does it look like to CrowdStrike? And build this, take the best attributes from each. Say, here's a really nice device. And that will help with their investigation, both in terms of having the right information and having it in the time fashion. So it does have a part to play in that. But I would say this is about reducing risk as far as we possibly can so that we don't end up in the emergency room.
And it would also streamline some of that detection and response, hopefully, by having all that data centralized so it's easy for them to do some of the investigation and the forensics work that needs to be done when they're in the middle of detecting or responding to an event.
Yeah, that's right. And testing exposure, right? So take the good old WannaCry example. If you've got the unification of data from your vuln scanner against that device inventory that we've pieced together across multiple devices, and potentially multiple vuln scanners for big companies that are running, with multiple business lines, multiple regions. Once it's unified, then finding your exposure to WannaCry is simply a search to say which for the SMB vulnerability, which devices is that present on? Those kind of questions become much quicker and easier to answer.
Yeah, I think the better you can keep your system, like have an asset and maintain controls, the less unplanned work will happen, right? To tear out a page out of the Phoenix project. But that was one of the huge lessons for me that, I think subconsciously we knew we had to patch our systems. We had to have controls in place in various systems and various applications. But one of the benefits of that is less unplanned work so that you can continue to maintain your security controls, right?
Yeah, it's true. So we call them fire drills, right? When we're in the security team, whether it's a newspaper story that the CEO's read, or the auditor or the regulator's turned up, or the business line or a customer, it just creates this sudden need to go and collect some information and join it together and clean it and put it into a report. And we just did a study actually across 200 enterprises. We reckon that 36% of the security team's time now is spent on collecting, joining, and reporting on data.
Yeah,
rather than doing security.
Yeah, it's so true. In this week we reported on an Exchange vulnerability that, from the article I read, looked pretty bad. If you had a certain feature enabled. So, of course, like you're saying, Nick, everyone's going to be asking that question, do I have this enabled? And oftentimes, it's scripting and PowerShell and manual work to say, oh, yeah, we have enabled on this set, but not this other set, and then what's the plan of action? So you're already starting a step behind in your remediation efforts if you don't have a good handle on what you have today.
Yeah, that's right. And then the question is, the CISO will say, well, so is this true? Can I trust this? Mm-hmm. And you're like, yeah, I think so. Whereas if we're doing this automatically all the time, we can build and build and build trust, right, rather than just these one-off exercises.
Yeah, and I question it all the time when I write a script to do any kind of discovery, right? And on a one-off thing, it's like, did I miss something? And then inevitably what happens is sometimes you go back and do it manually, right? Just to double check what your script, output is. But I like your point that if you do it kind of as you go, it's much better because it's more almost like an agile development model where you're just constantly testing and improving as you go.
Or you send it to Sam and me to review.
Right. That's the manual. That's the manual check, right? But I think breaking stuff up, breaking tasks up into smaller subtasks is important, and doing that on an ongoing basis is how we're going to be able to keep up with all of the complexity and changes and number of assets that we have in our enterprises today. Long gone are the days I can go to the data center and go, yep, those are all my servers, right?
And those are all my network connections, because I plugged them into my fiber router way back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Nick, any final thoughts while we have you here?
I don't know. I guess I go back to those key questions, right? It's do we understand our technical assets? Do we understand if our controls are switched on, and do we understand if they're operating in the way that we want them to? If we can answer that, we're in a good place as far as security is concerned. And I just say I understand it's a difficult problem to solve, but there are ways of solving it now. And good luck to everyone trying, and obviously happy to speak to anyone who wants to discuss the problem.
Awesome.
I'm good, Matt, if you want to. Oh, sorry. I thought we were like on BSW or something. I'm waiting for you to.
No, this is your show, baby. So I'm going to let you take us out.
Nick, thank you so much. Listeners that want to learn more can visit Panaseer.com. Links are in the show notes for this episode even. Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Nice to meet you guys.
Nice meeting you as well. With that, we'll take a short break, come back, talk about the enterprise security news for this week.